This lecture provides an overview of the development of social care law over the last 500 years, with specific focus on the position in England. 500 years ago, social care was, as it continues to be, primarily a family function, families caring for disabled, elderly, and ill members. And where there was a shortfall within the ability of families to provide that support, then they turned, as today, to the community for that extra assistance. And 500 years ago, that in England was the Catholic Church. And I think it's important to realize, to remember, to recall that giving was seen as a fundamental obligation of Catholicism, but of most of the major religions in the world. In Catholic terms, in Christian terms, it was called charity. It was not to make complex decisions about the deservingness or undeservingness of the individual recipient, whether they were elderly, ill, disabled, or some other category. It wasn't an obligation to make decisions about eligibility or some priority of need. The obligation was to give to those in need. And we see that in much of the iconography of the time, with effectively saints giving to those in need. But then political and economic change intrudes, as it does with this story all the time. The pendulum is swinging from left to right. And in the UK context, particularly the English context, the political dimension that intrudes is this gentleman, Henry VIII. Henry VIII, in his struggle to become the dominant power within the United Kingdom, ousts the Catholic Church, the other sort of alternative power broker, and declares himself head of the church as well as the secular state. Having abolished the monasteries, which gave support, he had to then create an alternative system. And that system is based on poor laws, which start to appear with increasing frequency. Much of the ethos, I think, of giving remains because the church remains an incredibly powerful force within the country. But we then see more statutes being issued, a whole series of poor laws being issued, regulating the way support for disabled people, destitute people is provided. And these are eventually codified into the Elizabethan Poor Law Act of 1601, an act that endures for, as we'll see, another 300 years. The parishes were responsible, so it became a council responsibility, the local parish. And although initially the poor laws were seen as harsh, they became much more generous over time, and they became part of the fabric of the culture. Parishes had to pay, and there was obviously resentment on landowners having to pay for that. But by 1803, over 10% of the population of England received poor law relief. And many of the commentators argue that at the beginning of the 1800s, it was seen as almost a fundamental right to support if you were poor. Now, as we'll see, that changes drastically within a few years, but it was over 150 years later before we again get to the situation that basic sustenance, basic social welfare law is a right. And today we would describe it as a human right. And one of the things I think that it's interesting for us all to do is to look around our own communities. You don't have to walk far in any town in England to come across remnants of the poor law, old buildings which were once workhouses, old almshouses, old buildings that were provided by civic dignitaries. And I happen to live in Herefordshire on the Welsh borders. So I'll just give you a couple of examples that are revealing of the way social attitudes were changing from the Poor Law onwards. Near to where I live is an abbey in the countryside called Dore Abbey. Very beautiful, very remote. But it's a fairly typical old church, and if you go into it, as if you go into many churches, ancient churches, you will probably come across a box looking a bit like that. This is the poor box that was part of the giving that people did at church for poor people. And this one has a sort of fascinating inscription on it. It's just in a corner of the church. There's nothing special about it. But if you look at the inscription, which is 1639, it has, as you can see, chiseled onto it a text. And that text is as follows. He that from ye poor his eyes will turn away, the Lord will turn his eyes from him ye later day. And what it is saying is that there really is an obligation on parishioners to give money to the poor, not to the deserving poor, the undeserving poor, the elderly or the ill or the disabled or any categories, just a duty to give support for the poor people. At this stage in 1639, although we had the poor laws, we still had that obligation to provide support for people who were poor or people who presented themselves as poor. Things changed very rapidly at the beginning of the 1800s. Of course, at that stage, we're in the middle of the Industrial Revolution, or the beginning of the Industrial Revolution and of the enclosures of common land. Poor people are being thrown off the land, poor people are going to the cities. They're obviously working in these satanic mills of which great profits are being made, but they are becoming less organized in terms of being controllable. And so we have the Poor Law Reform Act in 1834, which is designed really to curtail state expenditure on poor people, a bit like the neoliberal reforms today, where the state is going to be cut down, the expense of looking after people who are disadvantaged is going to be reduced. So we're going to move away from that 10% getting support, and we're only going to provide support for certain categories of people that we consider to be poor. People will have to prove that they are destitute, they have no proper clothes, they have no proper housing, they have no family near or wide who can support them. And if they do prove they're destitute, then the default position is they will have to go into a workhouse. So we're going to build workhouses and asylums like factory buildings where we are going to house these people. We're going to make it so unpleasant for them to be in that position that they will not seek support from the state. They will work even for pitiful wages. And as Engels said, that the Poor Law Reform Act of 1834, with this new sort of mechanism, was the most open declaration of war of the bourgeoisie upon the proletariat. And E.P. Thompson, in his great book on the history of the working class, says it was the most sustained attempt to impose ideological dogma in defiance of the evidence of human need. And if you, again, go around your locality, and again, I use the example where I live of Hereford, you don't have far to go to see evidence of what was happening in the 1830s, 1840s, 1850s. As I walk on the way to the train most days, I walk past this building. And if you look at this building, you'll see that it was, in former times, the public baths for Hereford. And you'll see that they were built in 1853. and then converted into swimming baths a couple of decades later. But what is interesting is that these were founded by charity, and it was for aiding the industrious. So it's not for aiding the poor, it's aiding for a category of the poor. And in Victorian periods, these were people that were industrious, people that were trying to find work. And today we use exactly the same language. We don't look to support people who are disadvantaged. We seek to disintegrate that group into worthy and unworthy people. We wouldn't say aiding the industrious today, but we would say hardworking families. It's a phrase that's used over and over again, despite the evidence showing that most people who live in poverty are in work. It's just that the work today, as in Victorian period, was very low paid. So we'll see today headlines about war on the scroungers, whereas in Victorian period, this would just have been articulated in different terms. They were then called not scroungers, but the feckless poor, people who were poor because it was their own fault. Poverty was a personal failing. And we have legislation to make people less eligible, so that the amount of poor law payment in Victorian periods was reduced significantly, so that it was lower than the very low wages that employers were prepared to pay. And today, similar legislation doesn't talk about less eligibility, it talks about making work pay. And of course, what that means is making benefits less than whatever the working wage is. But things change. The brutalism of the new poor law, of the workhouse, of Oliver Twist and Dickens, was often blunted by humane local application. A lot of poor law commissioners were deeply humane people. And of course, with the Industrial Revolution, with the poverty, with the slums came great civil unrest. And in 1848, there was what is known as the Year of Revolution. Throughout Europe, throughout Hungary and Germany and France and Italy, there were revolutions. And out of that turmoil and civic unrest, and Karl Marx and Das Kapital articulating these issues in very political language, we see the emergence of welfare states, more sophisticated welfare states. And the first example of that is in Germany, where Chancellor Bismarck creates a welfare state based on business providing support for workers. And one has to ask, and this is one of the questions that will be asked in this lecture, is why do we have this? Are we now having welfare states not to avoid destitution, but to avoid revolution? This is a welfare state that requires people to be in work, but if they are in work, they're going to get additional benefits for interruptions of employment. If they suffer a work injury, if they suffer illness, so on, interruptions that are predictable. But this is private funding, not public funding. This is not the German state doing this, it's the German state requiring businesses to do this. This movement for change continues. We see Disraeli writing Sybil, the story of two nations, and we see Seaburn Rowntree doing a lot of work showing that there is grinding poverty in particularly the northern towns, and it's nothing to do with personal failing, it's to do with the way society is structured. And at the turn of the century, we see a big movement to repeal the poor laws. Particularly Beatrice Webb does a Minority Report that becomes very famous. She and her committee call for the abolition of the poor law and a scheme, and the state to take responsibility for promoting health, education, and employment. And in the 1900s, the 20th century, we see Lloyd George introducing Old Age Pensions Act in 1908, so that every person over 70 was given 5 shillings a week, which was a huge sum at that time. And to raise that, he then introduced the National Insurance Act, which created a huge rumpus in Parliament and led to a constitutional collision, effectively, where Lloyd George threatened to create hundreds of peers in the House of Lords to see that legislation through, which he did. I mean, he saw the legislation through. Then, unfortunately, you have the age of sort of calamity with the First World War. And after the First World War, we have this great slump. The UK comes off the gold standard. And we have this enormous recession that really doesn't end until the Second World War starts. But out of that period emerges John Maynard Keynes and his general theory of employment and the idea that the state should invest in supports, in social welfare support during slumps, and then recoup the money during boom times. And that is adopted after the Second World War with the creation of the UK welfare state with Sir William Beveridge's plan. And that's very much the welfare state that we continue to have in the UK. And that was different to the German model, although there were obligations on employers to provide support, sickness pay, and so on. And there was the safety net, was the state would provide these benefits. And in particular, we see the creation of the NHS and the social care system. We then discover poverty again during that period with George Orwell and The Road to Wigan-Pier, and Peter Townsend, a social policy researcher, writing a classic book on poverty. One of the things we have to remember about the Beveridge reforms in the late 40s is that these came at the end of the Second World War. At the end of the Second World War, or the end of the 1940s, the UK's debt position, because it had had 5 years of total war, was incomparably larger than it was at the end of the financial crisis, or as indeed at the end of the crisis caused by COVID. But instead of cutting the welfare state, of going into austerity politics, the post-World War II government of Attlee brought in some of the most expensive things that we in the UK do. The Education Act, 1944, the National Insurance Act, 1946, the National Health Service Act, 1946, and the National Assistance Act, 1948. So even in the depths of staggering state debt, very expensive measures were implemented. And these are measures that we still live with today. And they have proved to be affordable. And Beveridge classically said that he was doing this to slay the 5 giants of want. The giant of want was slayed with the National Insurance Act, of ignorance with the Education Act, of disease with the NHS Act, and of squalor with the National Assistance Act. And I won't go into idleness, it's a longer story. But that was the idea that the state was in the driving seat in tackle these social ills. And part of that was the National Assistance Act. And this was the act which was, in a way, the Social Care Act. And that was to provide social care support for disabled, elderly, and ill people. Practical assistance in the home, meals on wheels, adaptations, community-based supports, day centres, activities in the community, and residential homes and care homes for older people. And as you will see from the slide in front of you, the National Assistance Act describes itself as an act to terminate the poor law. The poor law that started in the 1500s and had continued until it was abolished when the National Assistance Act came into force on the 5th of July, 1948. It ceased to have effect. And with that, workhouses were abolished. The distinction between deserving and undeserving was abolished. Families were no longer liable for the care of disabled, elderly, and ill people. It was the state's responsibility. And the stigma of being elderly was removed because there was Social Security support for elderly people, old age pensions. Old age was no longer seen as a burden on the rest of the family. And people who were without support, without employment or income, had an unqualified entitlement to support. But things change. With increasing prosperity in the 60s and particularly the 70s, we had a choice. We in England had a choice. We could develop the Beveridgean welfare state into a more modern, more generous, more streamlined welfare state, which is what happened in much of Northern Europe. We could move to the left with the state taking a greater role. Or we could move to the right, as was happening in the United States and Australia, and we could make the welfare state much less generous. We could cut the size of the state and move to a more residual arrangement where it was highly means tested, highly complex bureaucratic eligibility criteria. And as we all know, in the UK, and like much of Europe, we moved to the right. We moved towards the USA and adopted a system which was much more residual. So that, as I've already given you the example in relation to education, there was a considerable privatization, but also tertiary education for students. We eventually introduced tuition fees, not as severe, as drastic as the United States, but very drastic compared to almost the rest of Europe. And this is because of the neoliberal economics of what are obviously called the Chicago economics of Milton Friedman and Hayek. And they wanted to liberate the markets, the banks and everything, if they weren't regulated, would be able to create wealth and everybody would be fine. And this would not be based on public institutions. This would privatize those institutions. So in theory, instead of healthcare being provided by the NHS, it would be provided by private hospitals. Of course, that's been resisted in the UK, but in social care, we'll see that nearly all social care support is provided by the private sector, not by local authorities or central government. And with that, we move to managerialism, with budgets, with audits, with targets. We commodify, we put a price on everything. We create responsibilization in the sense that there are no rights without obligations. Even the most disabled people have duties to fulfill if they get any support. And these are the policies that are followed by politicians from the 1970s to today, in England at least.